Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. Today we're bringing you our second season preview of the 2024 season. You voted on it again. It is the Michigan Wolverines. Now, if you want your voice to be heard, if you want to vote on the next team to be given a season preview for this upcoming season, be sure to hit the subscribe button and go to the community tab on our channel. That poll will be uploaded shortly after this video goes live, so if you're listening to this right now, it should be there. And if you're new to the channel, basically we're going to break down what happened in 2023, a brief recap. Then we're going to give a 2024 overview for each team, their strengths, weaknesses, and schedule for this next season, and then we'll go on to our final grades and final prediction. Of course, if you like the video, if you enjoy it, if you agree with it, be sure to drop a like and subscribe, and if you don't like it, feel free to dislike. And without further ado, let's jump into the Michigan Wolverines 2024 season preview. Now, what went wrong for the Michigan Wolverines in 2023? Well, really the only thing was the scandals. I mean, Jim Harbaugh, former head coach, started and ended the 2023 regular season on suspension. For the first 3 games, he was on a university-imposed suspension. Harbaugh apparently failed to cooperate with the NCAA during an investigation on quote-unquote illicit recruiting during the 2020 football recruiting dead period. Now, take that for what you will, but the second suspension was the more talked about one for obvious reason. It was NCAA imposed, and virtually everybody in the college football sphere knows about it. It was the sign stealing allegations that were linked back to former staffer Connor Stallions that led to Coach Harbaugh being suspended for the final 3 games of the regular season. This was a big story at the time. Michigan accused of cheating. It was speculated they might have to forfeit their season, forfeit some wins, but the NCAA chose to suspend Harbaugh for the final 3 games, and I feel like most people are okay with that. Looking back, I mean, most people don't really care anymore outside of Columbus, Ohio. And now Harbaugh is in the NFL, and we'll get more into that in a minute. What went right for the Michigan Wolverines last year? And it was virtually everything else. I mean, they beat Ohio State en route to winning the Big Ten championship against Iowa, to winning the Rose Bowl versus Alabama, to winning the national championship versus Washington en route to an undefeated season. They had a pretty good offense in 2023. Looking at the stats, I was a bit underwhelmed, honestly. They were 42nd in rushing yards per attempt, 46th in passing yards per completion, and 81st in third down conversion rate. Not amazing, but I mean, still pretty above average. I mean, if you think back on that Michigan team, there weren't a lot of explosive plays necessarily offensively. It was much more so a factor of the defense being probably the best in the country. And if you look at the stats, they corroborate that fact. First in opponent points per game, first in opponent points per play, first in opponent yards per game, fourth in opponent yards per play, and first in turnover margin. Just a dominant defense. Probably, in our opinion, the #1 defense from last season and the #1 team, because they did win the national championship. And overall, astounding year for the Michigan Wolverines last year. Not much bad to say other than those scandals. And with that out of the way, let's get into the 2024 overview. As for the schedule for Michigan, they face Fresno State at home, Texas at home, Arkansas State at home, USC at home, Minnesota at home, Washington on the road, then their bye week, Illinois on the road, Michigan State at home, Oregon at home, Indiana on the road, then another bye week, then Northwestern at home, and then Ohio State on the road. Now that is a pretty rough schedule, but I mean, I guess it could be worse. They face Texas, Oregon, and USC, 3 of their toughest opponents, all at home, which should give them an advantage, maybe. I mean, all 3 of those teams are going to be super talented this year. But who knows? Michigan is going to have a quality team. They could pull out one or multiple of those games. And they face Ohio State and Washington on the road. That Ohio State team is massively improved from last year, and to have to face them on the road is a big concern for Michigan this upcoming season. And they face Washington on the road. A matchup not a lot of people are talking about. I mean, it is a national championship rematch, but I mean, for good reason, they're not being discussed as much because both of those teams are in a bit of a rebuild. Washington lost Kalen DeBoer to Alabama, and Michigan lost Jim Harbaugh to the NFL, so will still probably be a good game, but being overlooked for good reason in our opinion. And another big thing to consider when talking about their schedule is their first 5 games are at home. So, I mean, if they build up some momentum, they win 3 or 4 of those games at home to start the season, it could snowball effect into a much better season than we might be predicting or that others might be predicting, especially getting a team like Texas, that non-conference opponent, big non-conference opponent at home. I mean, you can't be too upset about that. If you are going to schedule Texas, you want to schedule them at home. I mean, they're no joke. And other than that, they will be playing what should be an improved Michigan State and Northwestern team at home. Probably not the biggest deal in the world for Michigan. I mean, Michigan State, of course, is a rival team, so you can never rule out those rivalry games. But Michigan State is also in a rebuild. They just hired Jonathan Smith from Oregon State, and they could be a lot better than they were last year, but I wouldn't hedge your bets on Michigan State beating Michigan on the road this year. And for their strengths, they have a pretty good returning offensive line. Michigan is known for their offensive lines, obviously. And even though they are in a bit of a rebuild offensively, the offensive line is still relatively strong and experienced. They probably won't be as good as last year, but I mean, last year they had a world-beating offensive line, so not too bad, all things considered. Still should be very solid. The defense also still has a lot of quality. They do lose a lot of guys on that defensive front, but each unit returns a lot of talent. The defensive line has tackles Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham, who are the biggest returning names probably on that entire team. Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham were phenomenal last year. The linebackers, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, both are returning, and they combined for 10.5 sacks in 2023. Big names there. And in the secondary, guys like Quentin Johnson, Will Johnson, and Makari Page combined for 56 tackles, 5 interceptions, and 10 pass defenses in 2023, and all 3 of those guys are returning. There are younger guys that are going to fill out a lot of those gaps, but when you have leaders at every single unit on the defense like they do, it's hard to believe that they won't have another great year defensively. I mean, if they're not the best team in the country, maybe the best team in the conference defensively. And other than that, last but not least, punting. I mean, they returned punter Tommy Doman from last season, who was a 3rd-team All-Big Ten punter and a 4-time Big Ten Special Teams Player of the Week in 2023. And I mean, punters don't really get highlighted a lot unless they're Iowa punters. But Tommy Doman was of the best in the conference last season, and he returns, so can't be mad at that. I mean, considering what the Big Ten has been the past few years, you're going to want to have a good punter who can flip the field when need be, especially for a team like Michigan, who is going to be playing a lot of defense. If they can pin the teams they're playing back within 20 yards, it may be the difference in the game, honestly. I mean, playing teams like Texas and Oregon, it's hard not to give up explosive plays. But if you're starting within your own 10-yard line, I mean, it makes it that much harder to turn those kinds of drives into points, which could lend to Michigan's favor. As for their weaknesses, they lost a lot of depth this offseason. Over 40 players to the draft and to the portal. They were able to replace some of the star talent pretty well, but depth is still a huge concern. Most of what they lost to the portal is obviously depth. Didn't lose that many key contributors to the portal, but that is still a big issue. I mean, depth was one of their strongest points last year, and they're going to have talent in there to replace it. I mean, Michigan has been recruiting well for the past few years, but to lose that many players in one offseason, it's going to hurt. You're going to feel it at least somewhat, especially with the new coaching staff who's going to have to try and adjust. And also their skill positions have taken a bit of a nosedive from last year. They lose guys like McCarthy and Roman Wilson, Blake Corum to the NFL. The running back room is going to be spearheaded by Donovan Edwards, who does have 1,200 plus yard upside. But other than Edwards, the room is pretty underwhelming. I mean, like we just talked about, it lacks depth. Could they have a guy or two kind of explode and be a solid running back 2 or running back 3? That's very possible, but as it stands, that room is really Donovan Edwards and a few other guys. And they have a quarterback, Alex Orji, who's slated to be quarterback number 1. And while he is a great runner and can make some good throws, he does have serious accuracy and decision-making issues. He hasn't looked great in the offseason, hasn't looked awful, but when you go from a guy like McCarthy, who was a very good decision maker, great leader, to a guy like Orji, it might make it a lot more difficult to flow as an offense the way they did flawlessly in 2023. And if we're going to player comp Orji, he's kind of like a Jalen Milroe at Alabama, just with a worse arm overall. And of those units, wide receiver room easily took the biggest hit. They really don't have a clear wide receiver one. They have some guys who made contributions to the team last year. Then again, they weren't a pass-heavy team in 2023. It doesn't look like they're going to be this year just by the looks of that wide receiver room. Going to need to see a lot of improvement there before we feel like we can give Michigan the benefit of the doubt. And other than the skill positions, the field goal kicking was not a great unit in 2023. They were tied for 87th in the country in field goal percentage. And they add a guy, Dominic Zavada from Arkansas State, who, while is an improvement, still didn't look great last year. A 77.3 field goal percentage, 100% extra point percentage, and a long of 53. So it seems like Zavada is a bit of a boom or bust type of player. That field goal percentage is just a bit worrisome. Extra points though, 100%, can't be mad at that. And on top of all of that, they bring in an all new coaching staff for the most part. I mean, Sharon Moore replaces Harbaugh, obviously, who's the offensive coordinator, was a fill-in for Harbaugh last year when he was suspended. But other than those few games last year, Moore has no long-term head coaching experience. Obviously, he knows the team, he knows the system, he knows the players. So it's not like they're bringing in a brand new guy with no long-term head coach experience. He does get the benefit of the doubt somewhat. And they elevate Kirk Campbell, who was the quarterbacks coach for them last year, to OC. He's been at Michigan for 2 years where he was the quarterbacks coach, like I just said, and an offensive analyst the year prior. And he was an offense coordinator at Old Dominion for 2 years. Wasn't great at Old Dominion, but then again, it was Old Dominion. And they hire Wink Martindale as their defensive coordinator. He's easily their strongest hire in this offseason. However, he hasn't coached in college since 2003. He spent a long time as a defensive coordinator in the NFL. And while that is good, while NFL experience as a coordinator is very good, it is a different game than college. So while he should be a pretty good defensive coordinator, especially with the amount of talent that Michigan has, it is still hard to pin down whether he will have like an amazing impact in year one. There still very well could be a lot of growing pains, probably the least out of the entire team, but all around those are still pretty solid hires. We'll just have to wait and see how things shake out under Sharon Moore before we can say definitively how good any of those hires are. And on to our final grades and predictions, but before that, we have our keys to success. And Michigan's first key to success is gonna have to be allowing Alex Orji room to improve, because what separated Michigan from a team like Ohio State, who also had a really good defense, was that in 2023, Michigan allowed JJ McCarthy room to kind of improve, room to make errors, and room to just trust his arm and trust his decision making, whereas a team like Ohio State was playing afraid of Kyle McCord messing up. And you could very well make the argument that McCarthy was just better than McCord, and I probably would not argue with you. But that's what separated a team like Michigan, who seemed to be able to click better on offense, from a team like Ohio State, who was really a one-trick pony, and that trick was get Marvin Harrison the ball and run it a few times a game. And in order for that to be the same story in 2024, they need to allow Alex Orji room to improve. Like I just said, he's probably not going to be the decision maker that McCarthy is this season, but you're not going to do him any favors by doing what Ohio State did with McCord last year and kind of scheming to hide his incapabilities instead of scheming to kind of force him to grow and improve, which would really be detrimental to his growth as a quarterback, especially if you want him to be your long-term starting quarterback. And for their next key to success, they're going to have to lean on the defense again. This almost goes without saying. Like I talked about previously, the defense should be very, very good once again. And I mean, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. It worked for them last year. The offense was above average to good last year, and they won a national championship just because of how dominant that defense is. I'm not saying Michigan is a national championship contender. Once again, I don't believe that. Not for a second. But they could still easily be one of the better teams in the Big Ten and a really good team overall if they just stick to what works best for them, and that is leaning on that defense. Their last key to success is scheming around Edwards and that offensive line. Now, this may seem contradictory to the first point. I mean, you want Alex Orji to be able to work, but the majority of the offense needs to be centered around Donovan Edwards. He is a good all-purpose back. He can run, he can catch, he can block. And you need to be able to get him the ball. I mean, he's probably going to be their most explosive player offensively. Other than Alex Orji, I mean, he can run, but you're not going to run your quarterback every play. So Edwards can be a security blanket. He can be a 1,200 plus yard rusher. He can be a 500 plus yard receiver, honestly. If you scheme it properly and if you get him the ball, it will take pressure off of Alex Orji and will allow him to make plays through the air and with his feet. So like Corum in 2023, the moral of the story in 2024 should be getting Edwards the ball, not making your quarterback be a superhero every play, and just relying on what works for Michigan, what has worked for Michigan for the past 5 or 6 years. And with that said, getting into our final grades, the Michigan offense is going to get an 86.5. This may seem a bit low, but there's just too many question marks. I mean, the offensive line is solid. The running back number 1, Donovan Edwards, is solid, but they lack serious depth. Alex Orji is a big question mark heading into the 2024 season, as well as that wide receiver room just doesn't lend well to what we predict their final output should be. And that is why they're coming in on the lower side for a team like Michigan. But when we get into their defense, it's a 96.0. Like I said, very solid unit. Could easily be the best unit in the Big Ten. And as for special teams, they're going to come in at a 91.5. The punting and field position game with Tommy Doman should be very good once again. But like we said previously, field goal kicking could be a big area of concern if Dominic Zavada isn't the guy that I guess they're hoping he is. I mean, last year he wasn't amazing, so I'm not sure what they're expecting with that, but that is what is bringing them down more so. But that punting field position game, I mean, going to be good once again. And as for coaching, they're going to come in with an 83.5. And like the offense, there's just a lot of inexperience for us to consider them being any higher. They could easily outplay their ranking because, like we said previously, it isn't completely new hires. I mean, Moore has been familiar with this Michigan team for years, and they've kept that core together. They hired Martindale, who should come in and at least be able to keep that Michigan defense afloat, if not have it excel again in 2024. And we should know exactly how good this staff is by next season, probably. If we don't know by the start of next season, probably 5 or 6 games into that season. If there's a glaring area of concern, whether it be offensively, defensively, special teams, we will probably know that by next October, if I had to guess. But this year, it is really hard to pin down. And while they do get the benefit of the doubt being one of the higher, less experienced coaching staffs in the country, we are still considering them just about average. And as for their strength of schedule, they're going to be one of the higher grades in the country. It's a 97.5. There may be a handful of teams in the country with a harder schedule than Michigan this year. Texas, Southern Cal, Washington, Oregon, and Ohio State in one season is brutal, but I mean, there are worse schedules out there. And that will round them out to a 91 flat, a low A, but still an A for the Michigan Wolverines. And getting into the final predictions, we believe Michigan has a ceiling of 10-2 with an 8-1 conference record. Really don't see them beating 2 out of the 3 of Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon. Those could be 3 of the top 4 teams in the country, and we just don't believe Michigan is on that level this season. And they have a floor of 7-5 with a 5-4 conference record. But fear not, Michigan fans, this is a real disaster scenario. A lot would have to go wrong this season for you to hit the 7-5 mark, because that would mean they lose to all of their tough opponents that we listed previously. And with that, we predict they are going 9-3 on the higher end of that ceiling and floor with a 7-2 conference record. Of their toughest games, we have them beating USC and Washington with losses to all 3 of Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State. They have a very, very hard road ahead of them in the Sharon Mora era. It's starting off with a very rough schedule, but I wouldn't judge Moore too harshly. 9-3 in his first year, especially with a schedule like that, is nothing to sneeze at all. And that is going to wrap up the Michigan 2024 season preview. And if you enjoyed it, go ahead and hit the like button. Subscribe if you feel like it. It really helps out the channel a lot. And be sure to go vote on the next team you want to see in the community tab of this channel. Like I said, it should be uploaded. And if you flat out disagree with something we said, feel free to drop a comment, whether it be if you think Alex Orji is actually a Heisman contender or if you think that Michigan defense just isn't good in 2024. We want to hear your opinions, so go ahead and drop that in the comment section. And be sure to tune into the channel later this week. We have a special upload coming on Friday. And with that being said, thank you for watching, and we will see you then.